In many ways, the conventions of 2000, one of which was held in Los Angeles, where the Democrats met and the Republicans met in Philadelphia, these were pretty much the last time that you could really cover in depth and see what was happening with political thought across the country. By now, I'd covered a lot of conventions. It was now 1976 I covered on, and now it's 2000. So that's 24 years that I've been covering these things. What happened in Los Angeles and Philadelphia were that the vice president, Al Gore, was nominated for the Democrats, and George W. Bush was the Republican nominee, ultimately became president. 2000 election would be tumultuous, and it's still with us today. About the convention in LA, though, first. This was a happy time, and I don't remember too much about the convention itself because nobody paid attention to the platforms and so on. But what I do remember is that one of the phone companies set up a cell phone about 3 or 4 blocks around the convention hall, which was at the Staples Center. I don't know what it's called today. I keep renaming these things, but so for 3 blocks around here, you could call anybody in the country on your cell phone, and they'd charge you. It was all sort of free. But it was like I'm talking to you now. Never before, and not since, have we had that kind of clarity in our telephone coverage. But these guys could do it. They pulled it all out after the conventions and so forth. But it was really fascinating and really quite interesting. In Philadelphia, Philadelphia was very concerned about, I guess, demonstrators and homelessness and so on. Anyway, they went across, up and down the street in Philadelphia and scooped everybody up who was, I guess, an undesirable, and hauled them off to some sort of holding facility for 3 weeks, I think north of Philadelphia. I don't quite remember. And they got, some of them were, stockbrokers and young guys and so forth and so on. The mayor at the time was a fellow, I think he was mayor. His name was Ed Rendell. Rendell eventually became governor, Democrat governor of Pennsylvania. But I kept running into this guy. He'd be coming one way and I'd be coming another, and we'd acknowledge one another. I had never met Ed Rendell before in my life and haven't seen him since. But it got to the point that he saw me so often, and I saw him, that that he began stopping and shaking my hand, saying, "Good to see you again." Ed. It was crazy. George Bush won that election, and he actually did win it by electoral votes, but he lost the general the number of votes. He won in the electoral college, which is where it matters. And he won by winning Florida, which we'll discuss in just a sec here. But he lost the popular vote by 500,000. And this is where this was the genesis of the real division split in our electoral politics and maybe in our social fabric, right here. Because this had not happened since 1888, where a president had been elected in the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote. And George Bush didn't lose the popular vote by a small amount. He lost it by over 500,000 votes. It turned in Florida over. Florida, there were 6 million votes cast in Florida. George Bush, when the dust settled, won that state by 537 votes. And there were lawsuits all over pressing and challenging what were called hanging chats, how you're counting essentially the ballots and whether these are valid ballots or not. And this began on election day, and it was in the courts where the Florida Supreme Court said, keep counting. And in December, it went to U.S. Supreme Court, and by a narrow margin, the Supreme Court said, stop counting. And with that, George Bush had won the election. It was pretty unforgiving. People were not on both sides were not pleased, and a case can be made for this, and this is where a lot of attacks on the Electoral College and it comes from. Now, the way we elect is that each state gets the same number of electoral votes that they have in terms of the Senate, where everybody has two Senate votes. Every state gets 2 senators, but then in the House of Representatives, it's apportioned, and you may have 50 or 60, or you may have 1. And then you cast your electoral votes in early January, and whoever wins. This is a situation that began in 2000 where the winner did not get the majority of votes. And I believe that continued. I'm not sure in 2004 how it was, or 8, we'll get to that. But for the very first time in 2024, the presidential winner, which is Donald Trump, got the majority of votes, and he got the majority of the electoral votes. Well, in any case, later on, the Miami Herald in Miami, Florida, went back and looked, because they're pretty Democratic leaning in South Florida, and they were pretty well convinced that Bush had not won the majority of votes cast in Florida. And once the Supreme Court ruled in November of 2000 that Florida should stop counting, that had they continued to count it, that Al Gore would have won. So a few years later, maybe many years later, the Miami paper goes in and looks at this, seeking to prove that Al Gore should have won that election. And what they found, and to their credit, is that Bush won. Bush won Florida. 6 million were cast, and he won by 537 votes, which is to say your vote counts. Your vote counts a lot. You and your neighbors can make a difference here. The other thing about this year was this was before 2001, and you could, as a reporter, you still had free reign to go wherever you wanted to. This would not be true in 2004. After 2000 and the attacks of 2001, the World Trade Center and the other uh, attacks in Washington, D.C., and the plane crashing out in Pennsylvania. Um, Security changed all across the country. It certainly changed in conventions, but it changed in airports and travel and so forth. It's a real watershed moment here. But it was also a time where the internet was just beginning to get traction. And I remember a reporter by the name of Sam Donaldson, who was ABC. ABC set up Sam Donaldson with an internet broadcast. And this is the first time I'd ever seen it, and where we began to broadcast on the internet. Bloggers hadn't shown up yet, but they'd be along. But this was, if you will, the coming of age of really the internet. And it was very early in the internet, by the way. We put the first, probably the first website in Oklahoma, at least for a newspaper, online somewhere around 1992 or so. And it was pretty limited in what we could do. And this was 8 years later, and people were still fiddling around with internet. This is, before 7 or 8 years before Facebook, now Meta, and Google was just an infant in its infancy. So things would change a lot between the year 2000 and 2004, and the mistrust and the belief on the part of the Democrats that they were robbed in 2000. And this is something we'll hear again, from President Trump, and in 2000, in 2020, that he was robbed, and that we began challenging the very honesty of our elections. Really began in earnest and remains with us to this day. And it is, from all looking, because we still had a robust newspapers and press, and they still wrangled with one another back in 2000. But by all accounts, it was the result of George W. Bush being elected president in 2000 was how it was. We were deeply divided. He won very narrowly, but the election was not stolen from them. And this is important because a lot of things, and particularly with the Supreme Court stepping in, which had even then had a Republican majority, this mistrust in our electoral process, and really beginning going one another's throats, I think, began right here. And soon enough, we had 9/11 and the attacks on 9/11, which was in September 11th, 2001, and we've been in challenged times ever since.